Here's 4 types of worship settings: monoracial, monocultural, monoracial, multicultural, multiracial, monocultural, multiracial, multicultural. Okay, so monoracial, monocultural, that's any setting where, it's people from just one background and they pretty much grew up in the same part of the world and they share the same culture. Monoracial, multicultural. That's like the church I grew up at. I grew up at a bilingual Chinese-English church. They're all Chinese, but half the church is English-speaking, mostly American-born, and half the church is Cantonese-speaking, mostly born in Hong Kong and places like that. So it's monoracial, and that church was bicultural. Number 3, multiracial, monocultural. This is the dangerous one. This is if you have people from different races, and it looks like the United Nations, but there's only one culture. We only sing one kind of music. The leadership only does things one certain way. Maybe you have missionary day once in a while to have different cultures, but mostly it's just this one culture. That's dangerous because you think you're being multicultural, but you're not. You're just being multiracial. And then number 4, multiracial, multicultural. So here you have not only different races, but actually different cultures. So different music, different food, different leadership styles are recognized, different ways of handling conflict, and so on, so on. Different cultures. And so NAPAD, which one is NAPAD? As you gather as NAPAD, what are you? It's 4, and especially because you have a good representation from non-Asian church leaders and denominational leaders, and that's great. But in a sense, North American, Pacific Asian, the emphasis is on one particular race, one particular category on the U.S. Census. Yeah.
We are very close to multiracial and multicultural. But question is, when you say multicultural, you are including language, multilingual.
Sure.
Is it multicultural?
Of course. Language is so much of culture, right? But it's not the only part of culture. So different races and different cultures. But when you say multiracial, that can have different flavors, right? You can have multiracial dominated by a majority culture. NAPAD is trying to be multiracial, multicultural from an Asian Pacific culture, right? From an Asian Pacific flavor of multiracial, multicultural, which is going to be different than a majority culture version of that. So different settings, and to try to keep these things clear, I think helps some of these discussions. There is not time, so I'm just going to talk you through some components of Asian American identity and experience. What are we talking about? There is, of course, Asian heritage, Confucian background, a way of looking at relationships and of power, of honoring ancestors and parents, of not bringing attention to yourself, of duty and respect, and not bringing shame to your family, all those things, Asian heritage. Of course, Asian history. You think about something like Buddhism, which dominates so much of Asia. But of course, Buddhism was not indigenous to Asia, to East Asia. It's indigenous to South Asia, right? It came from what's now India and traveled as a missionary religion to East Asia. Buddhism is a foreign religion, in a sense, to East Asia, even though it has become identified with East Asia in so many ways. So to have that as a heritage, and now here in America, people think of Buddhism as this Eastern and East Asian religion. The Christian history of Asia, so much of things we don't know. Christianity came to East Asia, no later than the 8th century. And we have this monument, the Nestorian Stele, which describes a century and a half of Christianity, and going back to the 8th century, this history that we don't even know, and yet is part of our Asian heritage. So Asian American identity includes Asian heritage, including some of these parts of Asian heritage that we need to know more about. Asian American identity also includes American culture and nationality, and all that means to identity. And part of that journey is the American experience with race. So you think, for instance, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the March on Washington, 1963, the I Have a Dream speech, which was a black Baptist sermon, right? I mean, that's the power of a well-developed voice in worship. It could become, this is one of the top 3 most important speeches in American history now. It's a black Baptist sermon. And calling this nation to a colorblind ideal, right? He wants his kids to grow up in a nation where they're judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, a colorblind ideal. In due time, we found out that colorblind could be twisted to basically become decolored, a decolored reality. Yeah, we can be colorblind if everybody can be honorary white, basically is how that worked out. And so in the 70s and 80s, we had these ethnic protest movements. This is Stanford University pushing for an Asian American Studies program there at Stanford because we not only want to be here, be admitted into Stanford, we want our history, our viewpoint, accepted and on equal footing with the majority culture. And that was the 70s and 80s, Black studies, Native American studies, Latino studies. And here we are into the new millennium, trying to make this multicultural society, our first African American president. Here we have movements like yours, NAPAD, and trying to figure out, well, what does it mean to be many and yet to be one? And it's really an open question. America is still a big experiment. And Asian American identity is part of that experiment. Who are we as Asian American Pacific citizens as well as Christians? So Asian backgrounds, American identity, a third component would be marginality, the experience of marginality, the fact that we tend not to be at the center, but on the sides, the margins. This is about 5 blocks from my house in Oakland. This is a freeway underpass, and this is a public art installation underneath the freeway, invisible colors. And you see it there, very, very legible, very visible. Well, where are the colors? They're invisible. All you see is the white outline. And this is kind of an angry person of color, piece of art is saying, look, the majority culture, the majority white culture defines all of us, but then you can't see the colors because we're only defined by the majority culture. Now, I was not raised to be an angry Asian American, but I sympathize with people who've had much worse experiences than I had. I grew up with kind of like the best of both worlds. But many others have not. And so the sense of marginality, the sense of having your culture not valued or understood. The fourth component of Asian American identity, past and ongoing immigration. We share this with Latino Americans, right? Immigration is still a live issue. A lot of first-generation people around. So here I am, third-generation Chinese American, don't even speak Chinese. If you count up all the Chinese in America, all the Chinese Americans, the majority are first generation today, in 2014. The majority of Chinese in America are first generation. They're not American born, even though we've been here 150 years. That's partly that's because of the Chinese exclusion laws from 1882 to 1943. That kept legal discrimination against Chinese immigrants. But partly that's because the rate of immigration is just, from 1965 to now, is just sky high. It's just all kinds of people coming from China and other parts of Asia. So this issue of immigration is still alive. First generation ministry is not just the past. First generation ministry is the future. First generation ministry is the future. Language ministries are the future. It's not just the past, because immigration continues at high levels. So those are some parts of Asian American identity and experience that are part of what we bring to church on Sunday and part of what I think we need more of in worship. I was going to talk about ancestors, and here's one way that some Asians, non-Christian Asians, honor their ancestors. And of course, for some Asians, it's a big debate. What do I do when my non-Christian grandparents want me to go to temple and burn incense to the ancestors, bring offerings to the ancestors? I'm a Christian. How can I do that in good conscience? It's a live debate to this day. No easy answers. Well, part of the problem, I think, is that we don't have good Christian ways of honoring our ancestors, especially as Asian American Christians, Asian Pacific American Christians. You would think we'd be extra good at this, but like most of Western culture, we actually aren't. American culture does not really spend a lot of time or effort to remember ancestors. We have Memorial Day, but for the war dead, but it's like, well, that's mostly a day for picnics and going to the ballpark, right? We don't really know how to honor our ancestors very well. If there had been time, there's not time this morning, but I would have had you try this out, a little ritual for honoring your ancestors. So I would have broken you up into pairs and have you share with each other a story about any ancestor, some ancestor that you would like to honor. Maybe a parent, maybe a grandparent, maybe a many generations ago ancestor, but someone you would like to honor and that you're grateful for. And then we might have spent some time in a little honoring of ancestors ritual. And you could do this at home. So you could set up a little table, have a nice, beautiful bowl here with maybe a flower or a candle, whatever. Give everybody a piece of paper and have them write the name of their ancestor, write the name of their ancestor. And then invite people to stand up. And they say, I would like to honor, so for instance, I would say, I would like to honor my Uncle Jason. My Uncle Jason, my father's older brother, he was the first one in our family to become a Christian. And this was, in Oakland in the 1930s, maybe. And it's a happy story that Christianity came to our family this way, and he brought my grandparents to church, and my father, and eventually our whole family. And here I am, a Christian. But it's a sad story, too, because my Uncle Jason, later in life, became mentally ill. And this close to being homeless. And he was really not in his right mind, and never married, and died alone. And so I look forward someday to the day when I get to see him with his right mind, with Jesus, and thank him personally for bringing Christian faith to our family. And then I would hold up this piece of paper and I'd say, I honor my Uncle Jason, and then you would respond, we honor Uncle Jason. And so we go through the whole, we invite everyone to do this. We have a bowl full of names. At the end, I would hold up the bowl, or you would hold up the bowl and say a prayer of blessing. Thank you, God, for these ancestors. Give us the grace to honor their memory and to live up to the gift they've given us. Something like this. Very simple, right? Very simple. Honoring of ancestors. And this picture here I have is at a different conference when we did this, and we actually had an artist there who really got carried away, and these are the names of the ancestors on the table here, and all these rocks, and this whole artistic thing. But you have people who can do this too. You have artists at your church who can create a setting, and you don't have to do it exactly this way. Be creative, do it your own way. But one way to honor our ancestors, and also to help our non-believing relatives to see, hey, these Christians, they haven't forgotten our ancestors. They remember their names. They honor them. If I become a Christian, I don't have to forget my ancestors. Maybe at some point I'll stop going to temple, but here I have this other way of honoring my ancestors, a Christian way, and that would be good. So there's one example of an Asian Pacific American way of a worship ritual that would be something a little different than the majority culture, which would express something from our culture in a worship setting. Part of what we bring to worship, and here I'm speaking of Asian American especially, Asian American culture, is, and people are, first generation folks sometimes are surprised by this, that me, here I am, speak English, fluently educated here, surely it must all be good. But no, actually for a lot of Asian Americans, for my peers, my friends, our identity is actually very unsettled. There's kind of a deep sense of not really knowing who we are and not really being anyone. One way of looking at this Here is an Asian American person, and here's Western culture, Eastern culture. And where on this scale is this person? Well, this person in their core is actually pretty much a mix of both. Now, the circle could be anywhere, but this particular person is pretty much a mix of both, pretty much 50-50. Their values, how they relate to their parents and their children, the way they make decisions, the way they think about their family, It's like in evangelism. You ask an Asian American, well, do you want to become a Christian? They're not thinking first about themselves necessarily, but thinking, well, okay, how would that affect my family if I become a Christian, right? It's more of an Asian collective identity. Okay, so this person is more pretty balanced, East and West, in their core, but in the range of acceptance, what this person thinks is good is more tilted towards the West. So for instance, this person thinks, oh my goodness, if I could just go to church and sing out and raise my hand and have it all out there and sing the praise songs like my white friend, then I could be a good worshiper. I could be a good Christian, It's like, well, no, maybe you come from a culture that's different than your white friend. Maybe your culture is more reserved. It does not bring so much attention to the individual. It's not as demonstrative, not as emotionally expressive. In other words, it's okay to be a worshiper like this, or even out here like this. This is not the only range of good worshiping. Expressive, extroverted culture. And so, but there's a tension there because the range of acceptance and the range of actual core identity are not the same. And we still get these messages to this day. Just a few years ago, we had this big debate. Amy Chua teaches law at Yale. She came out with this book, Battle Hymn of Tiger Mother, and the whole discussion about tiger moms. And the year her book came out, she was actually one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people. And Time Magazine actually spent the money to do a photo shoot at Amy's house with live tigers. They actually got live tigers to do a photo shoot with Amy Chua to do this spread on the tiger mom. And there was a review of the book in the Wall Street Journal. Wall Street Journal did this review with the title, Why Chinese Mothers Are Superior. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Talk about a racial dust-up, But notice it doesn't say why Chinese American mothers are superior. Chinese mothers are superior. Now, Amy herself is first generation, and she's married to a Jewish American husband, so her kids are Hapa. And there they are, playing violin and playing piano, just like a good Chinese mother would have her kids do. Yeah. Can a regime of no play dates, no TV, no computer games, and hours of music practice create happy kids? And what happens if they fight back? So this whole debate about culture and am I American or am I Chinese and who am I? It's a lot of inner uncertainty about who I am, and that's part of the Asian American experience. Russell Moy mentioned this yesterday, but a lot of times this tension gets expressed this way: forever foreigner or honorary white. Those are the two choices that are often available to an Asian American, Asian Pacific American. Just earlier this week, in California, I was at a Christian conference. And I was in this conversation with someone, and in the middle of that conversation, this person, Christian staff member at a conference center, she asked me, so what nationality are you, right? What nationality are you? And it's like, I started singing the Star Spangled Banner, because it's like, I'm an American, just like you, right? I did not, but, and it's not a big deal. It's a little more, it's not mean-spirited, right? It's not... it's not racially hateful, but it's a little ignorant, and it's hurtful, to be asked my nationality. I'm an American just like you, My family's been here for 3 generations, right? So to have that experience, forever foreigner, versus being honorary white and just blending in. And I was raised in kind of the assimilationist years of American culture and history, and so I know that side of it too. But it's painful. It's painful to be stuck with those two options as your only options. Do we have songs that talk about this? Do we ever sing about this at church? Do we have songs that bring this tension, this pain to church? Does it ever come up? It's part of our lived experience. I have a lot of friends who work in Silicon Valley, right? High tech. These are the Asian American high tech worker bees, right, of Silicon Valley. And they feel this at work. They feel this when they don't get promoted. They feel this when they hit the glass ceiling. Are there songs about this? Can we bring this to church? Does God care? Does God care about this pain? We can think of it mathematically. If I'm not really Chinese, I don't even speak Chinese, and I'm not really American because people have to ask me what nationality I am I anything? Am I nothing? That's how it feels sometimes. Or if I'm really Chinese and I am really American, well, then what am I? Am I two people? Depending on where I am, but I'm only one person, hopefully. So who am I? Who am I? I don't want to have two different answers. I want to have one answer. Who am I, right? So somehow, I think there's got to be a way of being those two things and yet being one person and bringing that one person to church on Sunday and being able to worship God as that one person. And that's part of the tension. That's part of the culture I bring as an Asian and Pacific American to church, and part of what I want to express in worship. Okay, let's talk about different ways of thinking about culture and worship. One way that I think has been very useful, some years ago, a Lutheran group came together in Nairobi, Kenya, and had a conference where they developed this way of looking at worship and culture, and I find this very helpful. Worship is always transcultural. So I'm going to give you four things worship is. The first one is transcultural. So worship always involves certain things that are true for all different cultures. In all different cultures, we worship God as revealed in Jesus Christ. In all different cultures, we proclaim Scripture, the Holy Bible. In all different cultures, we have a initiation ritual of water, right? Water baptism. In all different cultures, we have a table ritual of nourishment, the Lord's table, communion. In all different cultures, we have confession and forgiveness. We have petition. We have praise. All these different things we have in different cultures. We have sharing. We have caring for one another. All these things are transcultural, and worship will always have these in every culture. But as well, worship is contextual. Worship is contextual. It's going to differ depending on where it is. It's going to be culturally contextualized. And that's what most of my talks have been about, right? I've been talking about cultural contextualization in worship. The language, the music, the way we gather, the rituals, the things we talk about, different ways of contextualizing worship. Worship is also countercultural. There's always things in worship that speak against the culture because there's always things in every culture. We're all sinners. There's things in every culture that are wrong and that need to be condemned, need to be resisted. So, for instance, in Chinese history, there was this terrible practice for almost 1,000 years of foot binding, right? They would bind the feet of young girls, and this was to show that these girls didn't have to work. If you were a peasant, you had to work in the fields, then, that was one thing. But if you had some money and you didn't have to work in the fields, you bind your feet, and you didn't work, and this was culturally considered something valuable and good. Well, it was horrible. It's a horrible, cruel, awful, just sickening practice in Chinese culture for all those centuries. And it was actually Christian missionaries who helped bring an end to that. Bless them. What a beautiful liberation. To have foot binding stop in Chinese culture. Well, there's something, there are things like that in every culture. We think of American materialism, right? American consumerism, and how that is so much of our culture, and we accept it, and it's just part of our lives. But does our worship push it back against that? Does it push back against that? For instance, on Sunday morning, people vote with their feet, right? It's a voluntary church. You go to whatever church you want. Next week, you go to a different church, right? We don't have a culture of commitment in America because we have a culture of choice. You don't like your cell phone plan, change your plan. Hey, T-Mobile will even pay your cancellation fees, right? No commitment. Can we be countercultural in worship and say, no, we need, if anything good is going to happen, we got to be committed to each other. We got to be committed to each other in the good times. We got to be committed to each other in the bad times, right? And be countercultural in that way. So countercultural. And then worship is always cross-cultural. Cross-cultural means I share from my culture, you share from your culture, and we bring these things together in worship. Like last night, we had a sermon from the Black church, right? It's in the style and the cadence and the delivery and the topic, straight out of the Black church, and here in a North American Asian Pacific setting. And so the Black church is here was there giving its gifts, sharing its gifts with the Asian Pacific church. And in that way, worship was cross-cultural. And it's beautiful. So different ways to think about worship. And so don't think of just one thing. So in, let's say, Chinese culture, there's a lot of superstition in Chinese culture. Chinese are very superstitious about things like feng shui, things like luck, things like blame. There's always something to blame, because of bad luck or whatever. And those are things in the culture that need to be resisted, actually. To live by faith, to live by grace is actually kind of countercultural for Chinese culture. There's not much grace. Confucius did not teach us about grace. Confucius taught us about duty and responsibility. Did not teach us about grace. Did not teach us about forgiveness. And so in that point, Christian worship is countercultural to Chinese culture. Okay, I'm going to fly through a few more things. Here is a worship exercise. Last night we had some worship stations, right? Here's a worship station. These are maps of the world, and people are using yarn to trace out their families' journeys. It's a prayer station. Give thanks for their families' journeys. And we had even little labels that people put on the yarn, grandma's immigration and things like this. And it was beautiful. Nothing's more important to people than their stories, right? Than their family stories. It's just, it's so important to people, and people want to remember these stories and honor these stories. Communion setting, here's bamboo leaves, and this is coconut juice, and tropical fruits, and so forth. Here's a Japanese-American setting, tatami mat, actually Japanese senbei crackers, and we actually had hot tea for the cup. At a different Japanese communion setting, I had a student who was presiding, and she held up the cup. She's consecrating the cup, and she says, well, usually we use grape juice because it's dark, like blood, right? Grape juice is this dark, staining beverage, right? So we use grape juice because it reminds us of blood because it's dark, like blood. Well, today I'm using hot tea because it's warm, like blood. I was like, oh my goodness, I never thought of that. Oh my goodness, warm like blood. Jesus dying, with the blood warm and then going cold, Oh my goodness. So there's a communion setting, a tatami mat setting. Another communion setting. Here we invited people to linger at the table and to pray these prayers and to partake more than once. When we usually just take once, right? One piece of bread, one sip. Bible doesn't say just once. You could partake, several times. Sure, why not? Bible doesn't have a rule about that. And here we have different breads, including sticky rice. The sticky rice. Very tricky. How do you serve sticky rice for communion? That was very, very sticky. So we had to work with that. But, use some pita bread and use that to pick up the sticky rice. I don't know. This is actually an art piece at my former church. And one day a church member said to me, I don't remember why she said this, but she said, well, what if the Last Supper had been at a Chinese restaurant? What if the Last Supper had been at a Chinese restaurant? And I thought, well, what if it had been at a Chinese restaurant? And so I decided, hey, I can make an art piece, and this hangs in the wall of my former church. It doesn't spin, by the way. It does not spin. But it tells the whole story of the Last Supper. There's 13 place settings, body and blood, right? Bread and rice and tea. This is actually Japanese lacquerware. And I don't know why Chinese American restaurants do this, but Chinese American restaurants use Japanese lacquerware to serve rice. And so it's a Chinese American tradition. They don't use this in China to serve rice. They use this in America. It's like fortune cookies. Fortune cookies are American. They're not Asian. They're not Chinese. And so forth. So the whole story of this is the dish that Judas dips in, when Jesus identifies him and so forth. So an art installation, the Last Supper, the upper room, so forth. It's Jerusalem, Israel, and Gelo, which is an attic or an upper room. And I'm not an artist, but I could imagine this and put it together. Got dishes and got a tabletop, and you could do this. You could do this. So people at my church, some people said, well, I don't know if I like this at the church because if my non-Chinese friends come to church, this might make them feel excluded. Okay, think about this. My non-Chinese friends come to church, and they see this on the wall at the Last Supper. They might feel excluded. Okay? Now, I understand that feeling. But think about this. Are Chinese American restaurants for everyone? Hey, your money is green. Your credit is good. Every Chinese restaurant is happy to serve you, no matter what color you are, right? There are probably 10 times more Chinese restaurants in America than there are McDonald's. Think about that, right? Probably 10 times more Chinese restaurants than McDonald's. Chinese American restaurants, and that food that they serve in Chinese American restaurants, that's mostly Chinese American. It's not really food you'd find in China so much. It's this whole adaptation with the sauces and all this stuff, the stir frying. A lot of that is more Chinese American than Chinese. So, it's everyone should feel welcome by a Chinese American restaurant. And if we express the Lord's Supper in such a way, can feel welcome as well. Here's some beautiful Easter banners, beautiful Easter lilies. Hallelujah, he is risen. But wait, those are not lilies, those are water lotuses. Now this is a little tricky, and lotuses are a symbol of purity in Asian art, but it's tricky because the lotus is also associated with the Buddha, right? The Buddha sits on a lotus throne. So it's a little tricky, so what degree is this kind of Buddhist flavored, or what is this just a symbol of purity? Here we decided, hey, we can go with this. Easter, pure, resurrection, purity, water lotuses. There's no time. You guys can write music. Write your own songs. Write new lyrics to existing songs. A song like "Blessed Be Your Name." We sang "Blessed Be Your Name." You can just write new lyrics to that. Get your youth to write lyrics about their own journey. This is a song. I work really hard. I rarely complain. I try not to show it when I'm in pain. Right? Confucian, churku. Right? Don't show it when you're in pain. I plan what I say. I keep to my space. So I do everything right. I do everything I'm supposed to do. Confucius would be happy with my life, my choices, but I'm actually never not in need of grace. That's why I need Jesus. Okay, see that tension, that Asian American tension, that Asian American take on the gospel? Why do I need Jesus if I do everything I'm supposed to do? Why do I need Jesus if I get A's at school? Why do I need Jesus if I make my parents happy? So, but nevertheless, I need grace. In the early church, and I'll end with this, in the early church they had a saying, lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of prayer is the law of belief. And they said this because the way they worshiped helped them develop their theology. So for instance, they found themselves, they were worshiping Jesus the way they worship God. And they thought, oh my goodness, actually Jesus, and they hadn't really figured out how to put this in the words, but they finally figured out, oh my goodness, Jesus is God. The way we worship him shows us that he's God. And so the way we pray, the way we worship, shows us what we should believe. And that was something they figured out in the early church. Well, let's flip it around. the law of belief is also the law of prayer. So when it comes to Asian Pacific, North American worship, what do you really believe? Do you really believe your culture is clean? Do you really believe your stories and your people and your pain belong in church on Sunday morning? Do you really believe that your voice is just as important as all the other voices when it comes to worship? If you really believe those things, then let them influence your worship. Let them shape your worship. Let them become your law of prayer. Because we're all practicing for heaven. And John says when he gets to heaven, he sees a vision of the throne, and around the throne are all these people from every nation and tribe and people and language, including North American Pacific Asians. And so let's practice here for what we'll be doing for eternity. Okay, that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for your attention. There's so much more, of course.